I love hiking. It's always been my way of disconnecting, clearing my mind, and getting away from the chaos of the city. I'm 24, live in Portland, and when the weekend hits, you'll usually find me on some trail deep in the Cascades. But this hike is one I'll never forget, and not for any good reason. It was mid-October, and the weather was perfect cool, crisp air with the leaves just starting to turn. I wanted to hit a trail that wasn't too crowded, so I chose the Sentinel Trail. It's a lesser-known path, more isolated and rugged, which is exactly why I liked it. I'd been there a couple of times before, and though it was tough, I always enjoyed the solitude. This time, though, the silence felt different. I started around noon, figuring I'd be done well before dark. The trail was quiet, like unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just that time of year. But as I hiked further, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. About an hour into the hike, I reached a small clearing. It was here that things got strange. I was about to stop for water when I heard a sound I couldn't quite place at first. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. It sounded like crying. Faint but unmistakable, coming from deeper in the woods. I stood still, listening, my heart picking up its pace. I told myself it was probably just another hiker, maybe someone lost or injured, but that didn't make me feel any better. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I crept through the trees, trying to stay quiet. The sobbing grew louder. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, but curiosity kept pushing me forward. That's when I saw them. Through the thick trees, I spotted 3 people. 2 men standing over a woman. She was on her knees, hands tied behind her back, tears streaming down her face. She looked terrified. My stomach dropped. Something was very, very wrong. One of the men was tall, broad-shouldered, and holding a knife. The other guy was shorter, but built like a linebacker. They weren't saying much, but the taller one leaned in and whispered something to the woman, and she started sobbing harder. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen paralyzed by the fear of what I was witnessing. Then, without warning, the tall guy lifted the knife and plunged it into her chest. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I watched as the woman crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath her. The 2 men stood over her lifeless body, like they'd done this before, like it was nothing. I knew I had to get out of there. I slowly backed up, trying not to make a sound, but I was shaking so badly I wasn't paying attention to where I was stepping. I stepped on a branch, and the loud crack might as well have been a gunshot in the dead silence. The 2 men whipped around, locking eyes with me. For a split second, no one moved. Then, without a word, they started running toward me. I bolted. My legs were on autopilot, sprinting back down the trail as fast as I could. I could hear their footsteps behind me fast, getting closer. The forest blurred around me, and the only thing I could focus on was not tripping over the rocks and roots beneath my feet. But I wasn't fast enough. I could feel them gaining on me, and panic set in. My lungs were on fire, and my legs were starting to give out. I made a sharp turn off the trail, hoping to lose them in the trees. That's when I felt my foot catch on something, and I went down hard. Pain shot through my ankle as I hit the ground. I scrambled to get back up, but it was too late. The 2 men were standing over me. "You shouldn't have seen that," the tall one said, his voice cold and flat. I tried to get to my feet, but the shorter guy stepped forward, raising his knife. The last thing I saw was the glint of the blade as it came down. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, it was dark. My body ached, and my head was pounding. Somehow, they hadn't killed me, just knocked me out. Maybe they thought I was dead. I didn't stick around to find out. I stumbled back to the trail, limping my way through the forest until I finally reached my car. To this day, I haven't told anyone what happened. I reported the woman's murder anonymously, but no body was ever found. The police said they searched, but it's like the woman and those men never existed. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear her sobbing. I'd always loved hiking. There's something peaceful about being deep in the woods, away from everything. So when my friends Emily, Rachel, and Mike suggested a weekend trip, I jumped at the chance. We heard about this secret trail from a local in town. Apparently, it wasn't on any maps, but the views from the top were supposed to be incredible. We started late in the afternoon. The air was crisp, and the light was fading fast as we made our way up the overgrown path. Something felt a little off about the place, though. The trail was almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the bush, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt. Emily made a joke about how we were probably the only people stupid enough to take an unmarked trail, but her laugh was a little too forced. After a couple of hours, we decided to set up camp for the night. We found a small clearing just big enough for our tents, though the trees seemed to press in closer than I liked. We built a fire, sat around talking, and tried to shake off the weird vibe. But I couldn't stop glancing into the trees, feeling like something was watching us. Every snap of a twig made my heart skip. It was around midnight when I first heard the growl. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The fire had died down, and I was half asleep. But then I heard it again, a low, deep rumble coming from the trees. I shot up, listening intently. The others must have heard it too, because I saw Mike unzip his tent and whisper, "What was that?" Before I could answer, there was another sound, this time closer. Something big was moving through the brush. My pulse quickened. "Stay quiet," I whispered, hoping it was just a bear or something. But Rachel couldn't take it. She burst out of her tent, her phone flashlight shaking as she scanned the dark woods. And that's when we saw them, two glowing eyes, high up, staring at us from the shadows. I froze. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Those eyes were too high, too far off the ground to be any normal animal. They seemed to hover in the darkness, locked onto us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "We need to go," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. But before anyone could move, the thing stepped out of the trees. It was massive, taller than any person or animal I'd ever seen. Its long limbs stretched unnaturally, its body covered in shadows, making it hard to see clearly. But those eyes, they never blinked, never wavered. "Run!" I screamed, and that's all it took. We bolted, running blindly down the trail. Oh! The sound of branches snapping and heavy footsteps crashing behind us pushed us faster, my legs burning as I forced myself to keep going. I could hear Rachel sobbing, Mike cursing under his breath, but I didn't dare look back. Then, Mike tripped. I heard the thud, and my heart sank. I stopped, whipping around just in time to see him scrambling to get up. But the thing was already on him. It towered over him, its shadowy form looming as Mike tried to crawl away. It let out this horrible sound, like a mix between a growl and a scream, and I'll never forget how Mike's face twisted in pure terror. I wanted to help him. I wanted to run back and grab him, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen in fear. And then it was over. The thing lunged, and I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the car. My hand shook as I fumbled with the keys, waiting for the others. But when Emily and Rachel finally caught up, Mike wasn't with them. The drive back to town was a blur. No one spoke. We just left him there, left the tents, left everything. When we told the police, they didn't believe us. They said there were no signs of a struggle, no trace of Mike. It was like he never existed, but I know what I saw. Those eyes. I'll never forget them. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that growl. hiking had always been my thing. Whenever life got too loud, too busy, I'd lace up my boots, pack a light bag, and disappear into the woods. This time, I'd found a secluded trail out in the hills. It wasn't on any official maps, but that only made it more appealing. No crowds, no noise, just me and nature. I'd been there before, but something felt different that day. It started small, just a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like I wasn't alone. I shook it off. Maybe I was being paranoid, or maybe the quiet was getting to me. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. There was a strange stillness in the air, like even the trees were holding their breath. I pushed through for a few hours until I came across something odd. About 100 feet ahead on the trail, a man was crouched by a tree, staring at the ground. His back was to me, and he didn't seem to notice I was there. At first, I thought maybe he was another hiker, taking a break, but something about him felt just off. I called out, "Hey, you good?" No response. He didn't move, didn't even flinch. His body was unnaturally still, like he was frozen. That uneasy feeling crept up my spine. I wanted to turn around, but I couldn't just leave him there. I tried again, louder this time. "Everything okay?" Slowly, he stood up too slowly. When he turned to face me, his eyes locked onto mine, wide and blank, like he wasn't really seeing me. His face was pale, his clothes dirty, like he'd been out there for days. "I'm lost," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Do you need help?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though every instinct was screaming at me to leave. He didn't answer, just stared. Then, without another word, he walked off the trail into the trees, disappearing into the dense brush. I stood there for a minute, trying to shake the weirdness of the encounter. It didn't sit right with me, but I convinced myself it was nothing, just a weird guy who'd lost his way. I kept hiking, but the feeling stayed with me. Every few minutes, I found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing behind me. The further I went, the more paranoid I became. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my own footsteps. About an hour later, I decided to turn back. The sun was starting to dip, and the last thing I wanted was to be out here after dark. As I retraced my steps, I kept my eyes on the trail, half expecting to see that man again. But instead, I saw something else, something worse. Footprints. Fresh ones, slightly ahead of mine. They weren't there when I first came through, and they weren't mine. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse spiking. The prints were large, too big to belong to the man I'd seen earlier. Whoever made them had been following me. They led off the trail into the trees, the same direction the man had vanished into. That's when I heard a twig snapping to my right. I spun around, my heart pounding. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, the shadows deeper now that the sun was setting. I started walking faster, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Every few steps, I heard footsteps, rustling, twigs breaking. Someone was following me, staying just out of sight, always in the shadows. I broke into a jog, desperate to make it back to my car before nightfall. But the faster I moved, the more frantic the sounds behind me became, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't want me to leave. I could feel eyes on me, tracking my every step. When I reached the trailhead, I thought I was safe. I practically sprinted the last few feet to my car. But as I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the trail, and my stomach dropped. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was the man from earlier. He was just standing there, watching me, his face still blank, his body too still. But now he wasn't alone. Behind him, half hidden in the shadows, I saw something else. It was tall, towering over the man, with long, unnaturally thin limbs and a face I couldn't quite make out. But its eyes were like black holes, pulling in all the light around them. They both stood there, watching, waiting. I jumped into my car, locking the doors, and floored it out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I haven't told anyone about what happened that day. No one would believe me, anyway. But I know one thing for sure. That man wasn't lost. He was waiting, and whatever was with him was following me. I've since learned that sometimes it's not the wilderness you need to fear. It's what's hiding inside it.